Hi, I'm Doug, your tech support representative at Atlantic British, and in this video we're going to touch base on one of the maintenance kits that we have available for the 2002 to 2005 Freelander. It's part of our maintenance and repair academy that you'll find on our website, and also on our website you'll find a sheet that you can download and print, which will list all the other maintenance factors that you can get for the Freelander. Now the one we're going to talk about here is going to be the coolant kit, which is kit number COOL KIT 110 SKA. And what that's going to basically give you is pretty much everything you need to replace both the hoses, thermostat housing in your Freelander. Now this is on the KV6 2.5 V6 engine, which to access the thermostat and the elbow coupler above that, you have to remove the upper intake manifold. So you're going to find lower intake manifold gaskets, intake manifold O-rings, clamps for some of the hoses. These are the O-rings for the bottom of the upper intake, and then of course your upper and lower radiator hoses and your heater hoses. Pretty much everything you're going to need to change it over. Now it is recommended every 105,000 miles. Just like anything else, a rubber-based compound. Hoses are all rubber. They're going to break down. They're slowly going to get weak. They're going to get soft on the corners. And let's face it, you don't want to be stuck on the side of the road with a blown radiator hose. Really makes for a long walk home. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop the hood on this Freelander. We're going to show you the basic locations of these hoses and some tips on how to change things over. Alright, so what we're going to start is right from the very beginning. We're going to remove the engine shroud, and then we're going to get into the intake snorkel on this side and the PCV hose, and then also one of the vacuum lines. We'll start with that. This is a little bit involved, so you're going to spend some time on this. If you're doing this in your driveway, it is quite possible. You can do it. Probably going to end up spending about 3, maybe 4 hours total time. So figured I'd give you a forewarning, let you know this is not a 2-minute job. So we'll start with the cover, which is a quick job. And all we need to do is loosen the clamps on the 2 hoses on both sides. This is your intake side. And then your snorkel, which is just above your mass airflow sensor. And you're going to turn these 2 knobs that are mounted on the front about 180 degrees. You'll feel them release. And then you have a flexible pull strap back here where you just pull up on the loop and unhook it off of the back of the cover. Lift up, release, and that's out of the way. Next we'll start with the PCV hose. These have a quick release on them. You'll see these red rings, and they're just a matter of depress, push the hose down, depress, and lift. Now inside of these is an O-ring. While you have the hose out, it's a good idea to look down inside, inspect that O-ring for any breaks or cracks. These are replaceable. You can get these O-rings and replace them separately, which is a good thing. Be very careful with this PCV hose. You do get a new one with the kit, and the reason being is as these get older and because they're mounted on top of the engine, they become very brittle, and because of that they easily break. Now you've got one connection up front, you have another similar connection, and this one is kind of tucked in the back, so you'll need to reach in with the needle nose to be able to push in on that red ring. So alright, we've got the PCV hose out. You have your quick disconnect under here, your one up front, and then where it has a clamp right here on the boot, you can simply loosen the clamp, and then there's a white 90-degree elbow that just pulls right out of there. So the next one we're going to remove is this vacuum line. This is essentially the same at the 2 ends. You're going to push down, depress, pull up. Same thing with the back side. Push down, depress, pull up. And then right here you're going to see a white quick disconnect. You just squeeze the 2 tabs, lift up on the vacuum line, and that comes right out. So now we have the 2 lines out of the way. Now to remove the snorkel, you'll see you have a clamp right here. We have an electrical connection that needs to come off. This is for the idle air control motor. This we have for your cold air intake temperature sensor. and for your mass airflow sensor. We get those 3 wires up out of the way. Now, you also have another line right here, and that goes into a squeeze clamp that's mounted on the side. I usually find, now I use a 90-degree, if anything with a sharp point or whatnot, where you can get just up underneath and you can see how easily they release once you get to them. And then you've got essentially a 90-degree white plug-in. We have that off. And then we have a squeeze plug for this rear vacuum line, which connects in the back of the motor and ends up supplying the vacuum for the brake booster. Again, a white 90-degree elbow. This one has like a squeeze type clamp on it, which if you work the end you can get it out without fooling around too much with the clamp. Alright, we'll leave the clamp on the hose so that we don't lose track of that. And then your clamp on your boot. Now you're going to notice when you take these out, and you're going to see oil laying in the bottom here. And believe it or not, even according to the Land Rover engineers, this is quite normal on this particular engine design, so don't panic. Alright, we move the lines back down. That's going to unclamp that, unclamp that. And we'll just connect the electrical feed there. Now you have a quick disconnect here. This line right here is what feeds vacuum to the brake booster. And you have 2 squeeze clamps. They're in an awkward position, but you can squeeze them, you can see that comes right out. And then on the top of the intake, we have one more quick disconnect. Again, push down on the hose, then push down to press the red ring, pull up on the hose, and that's out. So now we have this out of the way. Next is the fuel line. There's a green plastic protective boot over that, but you'll see that this is essentially just a squeeze and release. Now, if you've recently run the vehicle, you're going to have some fuel pressure in there. So always wrap a rag around that line before you disconnect it, just to avoid any spray in your face or the eyes. And you can see there was a little bit of pressure left in that one as well. And we're going to tuck that out of the way. So now we continue down, disconnecting the harness. Our electrical connection there. And then we're also going to have one on the control motor on the intake. This is a variable orifice intake, which has 2 motors that operate flappers inside the intake. Alright, so we got that all off. Now what we're going to do is back behind the intake manifold, you've got 2 mounting brackets, and I believe they're 8mm head bolts, and they're a little difficult to see. You got to more than feel them to know they're back there, because the 2 brackets actually help support this harness bracket and the back of the intake manifold. So let's grab a wrench and we'll get those taken off. Alright, so we've taken the 2 8mm head bolts off the back. You can, when you run your hand back there, you'll feel the bracket. There are 2 bolts at each end of the manifold, and they point downward towards the back of the vehicle, just so you don't grab the wrong bolt. And then there are 2 Phillips screws up top. You can just take those out with a short Phillips driver here and here, and then that takes the harness bracket and moves that right out of the way. So we're essentially got to the point now we're about ready to take this intake off. We do have one more vacuum line right here, which you'll have to twist, squeeze the tabs, and lift. That gets that out of the way. Now, in most cases on these, you'll find the battery cable coming off and going to the alternator basically runs in the way of this one bolt. And you really don't want to move this or disconnect this without disconnecting the battery first, because should you ground out your tool on the lifting ring or on the alternator, you're going to cause quite a bit of sparks. So we're going to disconnect the battery. Tuck that negative lead out of the way. Now we can take the cable off the back of the alternator. This is 11 millimeter, or excuse me, 10 millimeter. And we'll lift that right up and out. Okay. Push that right to the side. That gives you basically a free shot on the intake. So now you have 4 10 millimeter head bolts that run from the upper intake to the lower. We're going to take those out. Grab the intake, you're going to rock it back and forth a little bit, and what that'll do is separate, give you a little separation right here, and then from there you should be able to lift and separate that out. You've got rubber O-rings in there that connect the two, and over time they get a little varnish on them, they get a little stiff, so they might be a little difficult to disconnect. So now that we've got that out of the way, we're slowly getting there. We still need to take the lower intake off yet, so that we can access the thermostat and all the hose endings. Now what we need to do is we need to move this electrical harness out of the way, and so we can get the fuel rail out. And once the fuel rail is out, we'll be able to access and remove the back half of the lower intake manifold. So first we'll start with the coil wires. We're going to unplug off the coils. If you trace the wire down, then you'll find that actually this first one is cylinder 3, so we're going to mark it. We got a gel type pen, or you can use a Sharpie or whatever, just so that you can read it. So this is number 3, this is number 1, so that would make this number 5. So when you install them back on, you want to make sure you got the number 3, 1, 5. As I say, in some cases usually they're a little tight, and just give a little wiggle just to break it loose. You can hear them, they'll actually pop. Don't need to squeeze tight, just enough to get a grip on the rubber. Okay, so now we've moved those out of the way. We've disconnected and unplugged the feed wires for the alternator. And we're going to disconnect your coils. Small retainer right there. We have a ground wire that runs to the coil. It should be 10 millimeter. Always make sure you put your hardware down where you can find it. Actually, the cowl tray makes a nice area right there, so nothing's going to roll off and disappear on you should you accidentally bump into it. And we have another little pop-in plastic retainer here for the harness. And one more here. Alright. So now we'll unplug the injectors. On the front side, you won't need to, or we will need to do it on the back side, so that we can take the fuel rail out so that we can lift and remove this back intake. Alright, so that gets that harness out of the way. You don't really need to worry about numbering these injector connectors because they pretty much, when you lay the harness back in place, they kind of fall right in to show you where they belong. They're really not easily interchangeable. Okay. Now, just as a note, there is a coolant line that bolts onto this. You have a coolant opening. Normally you would drain the whole system before you even get into this because you know you're going to be changing the hoses and the thermostat and whatnot. But because we're doing this for a basically demonstrative purpose, we really don't want to open up the cooling system. We're not going to drain the system. We're just going to pinch off the hoses so that we can hold on to most of our coolant. So next step is we take the 4 bolts out for the fuel rail. They're an 8mm head. 2 in the back are relatively easy to get at. 1 in the front not too bad, but they have one that sits just below the ignition coil, so you can either take the coil out and remove it with a straight extension and socket, or in this case I have an 8mm universal socket. So I'm able to reach that, and that makes it a little bit easier. It's just one less thing you got to take apart. Now there are clips on the top of the injectors that need to be removed before you lift the fuel rail off, because you aren't going to be able to remove this fuel rail if you leave the injectors, especially in the fronts, if you leave them in place on the rail. They won't fit through the opening. You'll see on the back side you got a nice flat tab, and you can just pry each clip off with a decent size, like a number 2 or number 3 flat blade screwdriver. And don't worry if you do happen to drop a bolt or a clip down inside. Once you get this back intake off, you're going to have full access to the valley. Find all your hardware before you put it all back together. We're just going to pry up gently to get the fuel rail to disconnect. These O-rings, yeah, they get a little hard and brittle. You can put the screwdriver between the flat of the mounting bracket and the engine, and then just simply lift up a little bit. Okay, so we got the front disconnected. And there's the rear. Now, what we'll try to do is slide the fuel rail. Oh, looks like we have another couple connectors here. These are just pop-on plastic rivets that hold the harness onto the rail. Tuck that out of the way. Okay, so our next step is going to be, we have a small coolant line that runs from the lower intake on the front, junctions into a cross hose, which then runs back and plugs in right here on the lower intake on the back side. So I've already pulled the clamp and disconnected the hose. We're going to slide that out of the way. I've already compressed and raised the clamp on this hose so that we can just remove that. And then just so I don't end up having a lot of flow blowing all over the vehicle, I've clamped the hose off. And now we're just going to send that to the side. Now we've got one more vacuum line just underneath the harness here. You can see there's another quick disconnect red cap there, and the hose crosses back and connects into the lower intake there. So we're going to disconnect it at that point. And then just raise the line just a little bit. Again, be very careful with these lines. As they get older, they get very brittle. And you can do that. You can either set this to the side, or if you like, with a pair of needle nose, you've got another little retainer for the harness right here, which we can disconnect. And it's just a matter of popping it out of the bracket that it's mounted in. Alright, so we've taken the hose out, we've got it disconnected. We're going to set this aside, and like I said, we're putting them in the order that we're taking them out, so that when we go to reassemble the vehicle, we don't miss anything. So the next step is going to be, we're going to take the front tube assembly out. We've got 4 bolts across the top with 10mm heads, and then there are 3 underneath. Get yourself a flashlight so that you can see what you're doing, but they are accessible. Best bet is usually with a long extension and 3/8 drive and a 10mm flex head, and one that will stay in position so that you can get it started. Now I'll give you a hint on this. To take them out, not a big deal. They can drop down into the valley. They're not going into the engine. You can pick them back out once you take the intakes out. But when we go to reassemble them, I would definitely recommend a tool with flexible fingers. This is the type of tool you depress and you can extend the fingers out. You can put your bolt on the end of these, sneak them down underneath to get them started. Otherwise, it's very difficult to get your hand down in there, even if you move the harness and move some of the hoses. So I would say at this step, make sure you have a tool similar to this. I like this one because it has a light that comes on the end. I can see where the bolt's going. This way I'm not trying to hold a flashlight and start the bolt at the same time. So keep that in mind. So we're going to take these top 4 out, the bottom 3 out. Again, we can let them drop down inside the valley. Once we get the intakes off, we can easily retrieve all our hardware that we drop in there. So with the front manifold out of the way, the bottom bolts for the rear manifold are very easy to get at, just a straight shot. Alright, so we have both the lower intakes off. You can see now you've got everything right out in the open. There's your 3 hoses that you're going to disconnect. You have the pull clips on them. You have the cross tube. Now you notice we have a bit of a mouse nest down in here, which is very common, and you may very well run into that. They like that nice warm area underneath. Where you also have, the mouse has chewed up the convolute over this wire that goes to the sensor. And this would be a good time. You can go to your local hardware store. They do sell this plastic convolute. I would recover it and then just take a shop vac, and you want to clean out all that debris and the mouse nest in there. The thing I want to touch on is the 2 gaskets that you're going to replace for the lower intakes, and you do get these with the kits, are actually a very hard gasket. And if you're careful and just gently lift up on different areas, you can actually get it to break loose without leaving any heavy residue on the intake. So then you can just take a scrubby pad and a cleaner and just clean that off. If you can ever avoid it, you really don't want to take a scraper to an aluminum surface. If you should dig that surface by accident, now you've got a problem. You could probably develop an air leak. So as you can see, now this is an original gasket. This came out relatively easy. Just got to be slow and gentle with it. It will come out. And we'll do the same with the front. We'll take a shop vac, we'll clean that area out, and we'll throw a little fresh convolute on that wire. And then we're going to show you how the hoses match up for the kit and what you need to do to replace that thermostat. Alright, so now that you got both the intake tubes off of here, you can see you've got plenty of access to get to the thermostat, the cross tube. Now the reason we include this elbow right here, even though necessarily you don't have to replace it, you'll find that in most cases, when you take this off for the first time, you're going to break the bottom off in the motor, and you're going to have to break the bottom part out. They have a tendency to lock in place. 8 out of 10 times, these elbows break. So we're going to include it in the kit so that, God forbid, and it's going to happen, you don't have to worry about it. You've got the piece you need. Because this bolt comes out to remove this elbow, which is then on top of this bracket right here for the thermostat. So you need to take the elbow out and the thermostat. You can break these 2 clamps off. Here is your cross tube that comes with the kit. You have the tube, you have the elbow, and you have the thermostat. Now I'll show you a basic layout of the hoses. And as I said, these are just pull clips right on the top of the hose. You can take a 90-degree tool or a pick or whatever, just get up underneath, and once you lift up, that basically unlocks it, and then it's a matter of wiggle and remove. We're not going to take these hoses off because we aren't changing them on this. This is just for demonstration purposes only. So now we've showed you thermostat, elbow, and cross tube. Now we'll give you basic location on the hoses that come with the kits. You'll notice this with the heat shield on it is the hose that will attach down below. You'll see the top of the hose right here, and this is all just reach in, unclamp, pull a hose off, install new hose in the same position. But just to give you an idea of its location, that hose would go there. You have this lower hose that attaches here. This is the same where you'll pull the clip up, give it a wiggle. Sometimes you just can take a small piece of wood or small mallet and just tap that off, because initially they don't come off easy. They kind of freeze in place. You'll tap that off, and then you'll notice towards the bottom there is a sensor installed. Just unplug the sensor when you're pulling the hose out, and worry about getting the sensor out once you've got the old hose up in place. Then you can install it in the new hose, drop this back in place, same thing, unclamp, pull a hose, install new hose, and this is just a quick disconnect. This will plug right in. And you have your upper hose, which runs across the top of the radiator, plugs in here. This will plug in here, and this essentially runs straight across. You'll see it. You'll see the hose right here, or if you follow it up, goes right to the lower connection of the heater core. And last but not least, we've got a long hose right here. This runs across where the smaller hose drops down to a cooler plate on the back of the transmission. This runs across and down. It goes underneath the transmission pan. And this is just basically follow the hose and disconnect it at the end and put the new hose in the same location. But this will sit essentially like this, and then of course your other connection is right here. Now you'll notice there's one hose we really don't mention. That's this connection right here, and this is actually a large section of hoses that make one large assembly, and you'll notice how many clamps and short pieces you have in there. Land Rover has discontinued this part. It is no longer available to buy. So should you find that you've got some of these areas are very soft, or you feel more comfortable in replacing them now while you have the system down and you're doing the other hoses, you would have to do so with sections of regular heater hose and then try to splice it in. Unfortunately, we have no authority or power over that. They've decided to take this one particular assembly out of production. We just can't get it. So that would be the location of your hoses. Basically, you've now have installed all your hoses in their place. As I say, we're going to recoat and put some more covering on this one bare wire. I think we'll get some more convolute and recover that. Or you could wrap it in black tape. I prefer the convolute. And then once we do that, then we're going to get into putting the manifolds back together. Alright, so we've taken a piece of scouring pad. This is just a basic 3M scouring pad. This is normally comes in sheets like say 8x10 or 8x11, and you can cut it up into small squares. Because the original gasket comes off so nice and clean, all you need to do is just basically rub off the residue, which we've done here, and we'll do the same on this side. Now, the only trouble with these are that it's very hard to get the manifold in place and hold the gasket and everything else in. They generally tell you really shouldn't use or doesn't recommend putting sealant on it, but I've always had good luck with a high tack and just putting a little bit of high tack on the surface and just a slight bit on the gasket, let it tack up for a few minutes, and then put the gasket on the surface, and it'll hold it in place while you're putting the manifold on. It just makes life a lot easier. I've never had a problem with any of these leaking afterwards, so I'm sure you could probably do it as well. And it's just a matter of just a little light spray. We'll let that tack up. your gasket. Check your position of your gasket before you install it. So she's going to go on that way. This will be the back face. And we'll wait a minute, let that tack up. Alright, so we've cleaned off both the head and the manifold with the scouring pad. Put a gasket in place with a little bit of high tack. Put the manifold in place and have all the bolts just barely snug. Now the recommended torque specs on these bolts are 18 foot-pounds. And we're going to start from the center and work in a circular pattern just like any other manifold or a head you install. You always start in the center and work your way outward on a circular pattern so that there's no distortion on the manifold. We've got the rear tubes locked in place. We've torqued them. Let them sit for a few minutes and then go through it one more time just to reset, just to make sure we've got everything torqued properly. Now is a good time to change these O-rings, which you get with the kit. And just for display here, we're not going to change these O-rings on this particular vehicle, but just to show you how, small pocket screwdriver, just up and lift and peel that right off. The new one is going to be, you're going to be nice and clean. You wipe off your residue, any buildup that may be underneath the O-ring. And there's always a little bit. And then just simply reinstall right back on the manifold. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to do the same thing on the front tubes that we did with the rear. We're going to clean up the head, we're going to clean up the manifold, set the gasket in place with some high tack, and torque the bolts in place. Alright, before I torque this up, I just wanted to show this one little trick as far as how to get the bottom bolts into this front manifold. So you'll see this is that little grabber tool I had shown you earlier. And with the bolt clapped in place, you can see all four fingers are grabbed right around it so that it's concentric. And essentially sneak right in from the back. You got an open hole in the manifold right there. And then watching down through it, and you can bend it with your fingers. You just want to get that bolt in the hole. And maybe just 1 or 2 turns to kind of hold it in place. Squeeze it and release. And now your bolt is in there. Now you can just snake your socket in place, and then we're going to run all the bolts in and torque them to the recommended 18 foot-pounds. Okay, now we start with the hoses. We start with the small cross tube hose. We're going to plug that in the back. So what's nice about the quick connects, just push it in till you feel it seat. Give it a little pull back to make sure it locked in. And same on the front. Okay, and we got that in place. So next we're going to throw in the get the fuel rail back on. Make sure you've got all the O-rings on top of your injectors. Obviously on this one the O-ring stayed in the fuel rail. We'll pull that one back out. I want to make sure we got O-rings on top, and then we're also going to give them all a light coat of Vaseline so that the fuel rail seats in and we don't have any leaks in the system. So we've been able to snake this end of the fuel rail through the opening, get this in place with a little bit of Vaseline on all the O-rings. Everything just slid right in. Now is also a good time to put a little Vaseline on the 3 O-rings on the top of the back manifold. So now we're just basically going to torque down the 4 bolts. Specs call for 7 foot-pounds. Next we're going to put that coolant hose on that goes into both the manifolds. It goes up and over the harness. Push the front in, and I can unclamp it now. Sneak in underneath and push that down on the nipple there. Alright, then we just get a pair of pliers and slide the clamps down, making sure the clamps are in about the same position they were in when we took it apart. It'll give you your best seal. Alright, so now we're ready to put the harness back in place. And you'll see as far as like the injector connectors and whatnot, they all pretty much fall right in to where they belong. Make sure you hear a good solid click though when you plug them in. That's where you know you have a good solid connection. Okay, don't forget to reconnect your alternator. And we'll tighten that down and make sure you put on your ground wire as well. And then we'll put the nut on that, we'll torque that in, and then we'll plug the spark plug wires back in. Remember the sequence that we had when we pulled it apart, 3, 1, 5, and you'll be just fine. Right, so just want to remind you, before you put the plastic shield on, you want to make sure you put your retainer clip on the top of the injectors where they mate with the fuel rail. With the solid side down, you got a small groove cut in the side that grabs this lip on the fuel rail. You just got to find that little slot in the top of the injector. And you'll hear it click in place. Alright, so we have our wiring connected. We have our vacuum line hooked up. Alternator wire is on and tight. Ground wire is on and tight. Everything in its order. Make sure no rubbing wires, and everything's basically routed as it was originally. Now, you'll notice in the kit you got 3 small black rings, and what they are replacements for this part of the intake, your upper intake. Alright, and again, for demonstrative purposes, we're going to reuse the old gaskets, but this is what you would do at this point, is pull your old one out. Make sure you wipe any debris or any buildup that's caught up in there so you got a good smooth surface for the gasket to seat against. Locate the little tab. And set the gasket back in. Now with a little bit of Vaseline you put on the green seals, should make this much easier to install. And just make sure you have this back far enough so it's not going to interfere with it. And set your 4 bolts in place. Alright, so we got the manifold in place. We got our 4 bolts torqued in. This is your rear bracket, the harness support. This is up on top. We've pulled the harness out over the throttle body so we can make our connections. So the next thing we do is we need to feel down in the back here, and we have the mounting brackets that support the back of the manifold. And I guess you could probably either do this with a mirror or by feel, because you really can't get in there to see it. And just basically find your bracket and find your open hole. Alright, so we have the upper manifold now bolted in place. We've pulled the harness bracket up and have replaced the 2 Phillips screws so that the harness is back in place. We're going to plug in the 2 control motors for the intake. And then on the other side, we don't forget, we have our shield. We're going to lock in the fuel line on this. Make sure you listen for a good solid click so you know that it's attached properly. Put that in so. Okay, so then what we have is the 2 plastic vacuum lines. And these are just going to be push and lock. That one goes into the white and that into the top of the plastic intake. And then our big PCV, we have the 1 connection down underneath here. And then this will plug into the boot when we put the boot back on. Remember, we have our harness here. There. And then we've got to put our purge valve back in the back. That's going to go around the back. Plugs into the top of the intake. Forget you got basically a little mounting piece back here. that in. Listen for your click. And your wiring connection. And these we're going to wait until we put the boot back on before we connect the rest of the harness. Alright, so now we're going to slide the boot on. Mass airflow sensor pointing straight up. And give it a little twist, just make sure you're fully seated against the throttle body. And then we'll just plug in our attaching lines. Alright, so we have our boot on, upright, our 3 attaching hoses, and now we'll just finish up and plug in our harness. Alright, so we lost a little coolant in the course of doing this. Obviously we changed the hoses, you're going to lose more. When you go to top the system off, on the back side you have a hose with a bleeder cap. A lot of people miss this. Take that bleeder cap, back it off probably about 4 or 5 turns. Fill the system up, let it sit for a while. It needs to bleed itself down. And then once you've got it to the point where you can get coolant out of this, in this position, when it's down below the engine and below the level of the tank, then you know you've got all the air out of the back. Put your cap back in, get it nice and tight, finish topping off the system, start it up, get the thermostat to open, again, then let it cool, and then you can do your final top off. These systems like to hold a lot of air, so you want to make sure that you definitely bleed the back of this out when you go to top the system off. Definitely don't want to have it overheat after going through all that work of changing your hoses. So when you're ready to do the thermostat and hose changeover on your Freelander, call any of our knowledgeable salesmen at 1-800-533-2210, and thanks for watching.